Hey everybody, it's Todd. How are you guys doing? Well, here we are, uh, first lecture of money and banking. So we're going to try to figure this out. You're probably farther ahead in this than I am. Most of you took a class last block, so you at least have a little bit of experience with attending lecture virtually and learning virtually. I've never taken a class uh, online. I've never taught online, and so this is all a bit different for me. So anyway, I'll get better at it. I probably won't be very good to begin with, may not be very good at the end, but I'm going to do my best to get better at it. And we're going to do our best to try to get through this block and learn a little bit about money and banking. So to that end, let's get going here. And what I'm going to be talking about in the series of lectures today is just kind of an introduction to money and banking and financial markets, right? So just kind of some introductory stuff. I think in general, a lot of what I'm going to be going through today is kind of definitional, right? So there's going to be a lot of definitions that I'm going to go through, a lot of visuals that I'm going to go through just to kind of give you some idea about the scale of the concepts that we're talking about, such as the scale of the bond market, the scale of the US stock market, the scale of the Federal Reserve. And so anyway, so there's going to be kind of a lot of factual and definitional information. So to that end, obviously doing your readings is important. And in general, a lot of what I talk about today will hew pretty closely to what's in your readings. But also, what I'm going to be flashing up here on the screen in lieu of using a Blackboard is really just my lecture notes, right? And so the lecture notes that I put up here often are a little wordy, probably wordier than what I write up on the board. But you can use these and, definitely pause the video if you have to kind of slow me down. Make sure that you're able to copy the notes that are up here. But I'll kind of be switching back and forth between some visuals from your book, some visuals that I have put together, and then also kind of my typewritten notes that I'll flash up here. And so, definitely one of the nice things about doing this virtually is that you can pause, you can back up. So if something goes through too quickly, then you have the opportunity to try to catch up. Also, as I'm going through this lecture, I want to encourage you to write questions. If there's something that you don't understand, if there's something that's not clear, please send me, or please write the question down. We'll have an opportunity to have virtual office hours, or you can send me an email and we can try to talk about things and try to get things straight. So, okay, so let's get going here and talk about money, banking, and financial markets. And what we're really talking about this block is finance. So finance is one of those concepts that we all use the word finance in everyday life. We think that we know what it means, but when it gets down to really understanding what finance is, it's hard to explain, right? If you had to explain to a 5-year-old what is finance, I'm going to guess that most of you would have a bit of a hard time doing that. You might think, well, finance is just about money, but of course, that's more to it than that, right? Finance is not just about money. What finance is trading money across time with conditions attached, right? So let me say that again. Finance is trading money across time with conditions attached, right? So if you think about a bond or a stock or a savings account or a checking account, these are all ways that you trade money today for money later, right? When a firm issues a bond, what they're saying is we would prefer to have some money now, and we will trade you this amount of money in the future at pre-specified times, right? A stock is the same deal, except with different conditions attached. A bank account, the same deal, money now for money later with conditions attached. Now that sounds pretty simple, right? Trading money now for money later sounds like a pretty simple thing, but it is one of the premier and most important developments in human history, this ability to trade money now for money later. Because you can think about what really happens here is that through finance, you can turn ideas into practice, right? So people have ideas, but one of the things we know throughout human history, and you might know this in your own personal experience, is the people with the best ideas are not always the people that have money. In fact, those two things might be mutually exclusive, based on some of the richer people I know. So, how do people that have the ideas get money? Well, that's where finance and financial systems come in, right? Financial systems are ways that you can turn savings into investment. You can get money from those who have it to those who have good ideas. And it can become essentially an engine of innovation and technological development, right? So I think most economists would argue that right up there with the paper and the printing press and the invention of gunpowder and the wheel and the light bulb is also the invention of finance, right? And so it's not surprising that if you take a longer view through economic history, one of the things you see is that inevitably the most economically developed parts of the world were also the most financially developed, right? And it wasn't the economic development that also often led to financial development. It was often vice versa, right? So you think about Mesopotamia, right? The Fertile Crescent, the Code of Hammurabi, which is really kind of the first written law. Some of those first written laws are about how finance should be conducted. What's a proper interest rate? What happens if somebody defaults on a loan, right? You think about England in the Industrial Revolution. Why in the Industrial Revolution? Well, largely is because England had the most developed financial system in the world and was able to essentially marshal resources to turn ideas into economic development. And so finance is crucial. And it's one of these things that I think, honestly, for those of us who are Americans and spent our entire lives in the US, we often don't appreciate how important finance is because we've always had it around us, right? We take it for granted. We have this ability to get a credit card or to get a bank loan, or if I want to get a car, I can go get a car loan at the dealer. These things just seem natural to us, right? Every time we go to Target, they're trying to sell us a credit card. So these things seem very natural, but they're not, right? And it's easy to take these things for granted. And so one of the big things we're going to talk about here in this first part of our lecture is just a little bit more details about why finance is so important. And of course, thinking about finance also leads us to thinking about what we're going through now with the COVID pandemic and everything. And, one of the things that I think has been interesting watching what's going on here is you see that finance also is a lot about trust, right? Because finance is about trading money across time, there's an element of risk involved and risk associated with uncertainty. And so one of the things that you see in periods of uncertainty, like we're going through right now, is you see a lot of financial volatility because people begin to lose the ability to trust, both to trust what they know is true about the world, but also to trust each other, right? And so in many ways, you can think about finance as kind of the best and the worst of human nature, right? The best in that it represents our ability to trust and have these incredibly complicated social arrangements with each other. But it's also the worst in terms of it can, represent our inherent greed, our inherent inability to understand things, to fear each other, to fear the future, to panic, to overreact, right? And so in many ways, financial systems really just represent the best and the worst of humanity and in its all of its extremes. And so that's quite honestly one of the reasons why I've always been interested in financial markets, because it seems like it's quite an interesting way to think about human nature. Let's talk a little bit more here in specifics about why financial development is so important to economic growth. And so I'm going to switch over here. All right. And so why is financial development so important to economic growth? I think, as I mentioned here a couple of minutes ago, people tend to think about Mesopotamia as the birthplace of civilization and England as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, because that's where innovation was taking place. But the most important innovation that was likely taking place in these places was the development of financial systems, right? Historian Niall Ferguson said, the evolution of credit and debt was as important as any technological innovation in the rise of civilization, from ancient Babylonia to present day Hong Kong. And so empires have risen and fallen based on financial development. And so let's talk more specifically about why exactly is finance so important to growth. And there's really 5 things that I want to talk about here. First, finance is about risk, and finance allows people to pool and hedge and diversify risk. In other words, finance is a way to manage risk, right? So one of the things you can think about that happens whenever you engage in a financial transaction is that you're trading risk, right? Some people are willing to accept more risk. Some people are willing to accept other less risk. And so you can design financial transactions that allow you to transfer risk. The most obvious is, for instance, an insurance policy, right? What happens when you get an insurance policy, like a life insurance? You pay every month, and you pay a premium to the insurance company. What does the insurance company do with that? They say that they will pay you in the event that you are unable to work or if you die, right? So in other words, the insurance company is willing to accept some risk. They're willing to accept the financial risk that you will be hurt, incapacitated, or die, right? What do they do with those premiums that you give them? Well, what they do is they pool that risk, right? They not just insure you, but they insure hundreds of thousands of other people, essentially spreading that risk across many different individuals, right? And so that's what I mean by pool and diversifying risk, right? Is that financial systems in many different ways, and we're going to talk about this, how this works when it comes to bonds and stocks as well, but almost every financial instrument is a process by which risk is moved around, traded, right? Increased in some ways and decreased in other ways that give people more confidence and fit their economic objectives, right? And so one of the things that we see here is that households that have lower wealth and less access to finance are actually less likely to take risk. And that's important because taking some risk is usually the key to earning some income, right? And so, for instance, if you think about starting a business is risky, right? They're less likely to take those risks if they're not able to earn, if they're not able to obtain finance. Second, we've talked about this. I've talked about this already quite a bit. Finance encourages entrepreneurship, right? I mean, the first step to starting a business, right? Those of you who have taken introduction to entrepreneurship or maybe have had people in your family that have started a business, what's the first step? You write up a finance plan, right? You basically figure out, how am I going to meet the financial needs of starting and running this business, right? And so, once again, where finance is easy, it's easier to become an entrepreneur, right? And more entrepreneurs usually mean more innovation, and innovation is obviously one of the keys to economic growth. Finance encourages savings and it encourages investment, right? Basically, financial systems are the process by which people's savings gets turned into investment, right? This is happening right now with you when you're going to college, right? Chances are that you're not paying for all of your college. Some of your college is being financed, right? Either maybe indirectly through family members or more directly through a loan from the federal government, right? And so, financial systems allow other people's savings to be turned into investment, either investment in your education or investment in other forms of physical capital, right? One of the things that I think is a misnomer that a lot of people have is that poor people don't save money. In fact, the poor do save quite a bit, but the problem that the poor have is that they aren't able to save in productive ways, right? They're not able to put their money in a bank and earn a return. They have to save in other ways that may not be so productive. So one of the handouts that I've placed on Moodle for you is this article here, Utter People's Money. And you can see this here, the economics of cow ownership, right? And what this article is really talking about is how many people in the less developed world who don't have access to financial systems save by buying things such as livestock. What's the problem? Well, the problem is saving through livestock is actually not that productive. This is an article written by a couple of economists who estimate that the average return on holding a cow is about negative 64%. In other words, you lose almost 2/3 of the money and time that you put into raising a cow. And so you might ask, why in the world would you invest in something that has a return of negative 64%? And the answer is pretty obvious, because it beats the return on other methods of saving, right? It beats the return on putting the money underneath your bed where somebody could steal it, right? It beats the return on lending the money to your nephew who's going to go drink it away, right? And so these are the difficult choices that a lot of poor people face, is that they just simply don't have a productive way of saving their money. And so one of the good things about financial systems is that they provide people a productive and profitable way to save their money. And as a result, not only help savers, but also help investors who now have access to that money. All right. Fourth, financial systems encourage liquidity, which reduces risk, right? Liquidity is a word that we're going to use a lot. You've seen this word, obviously, in a lot of your other finance courses. Liquidity meaning the ease by which things can be turned into money, right? And so one of the things that financial systems help us do is to develop financial instruments that can both provide you with higher returns, but also can be easy to sell, so that if you need money, you can get money quickly, right? Once again, this is the problem with livestock, right? When you save with livestock, you buy a goat as savings. Oftentimes, it's not very easy to sell that goat, right? One of the beautiful things about buying a treasury bill is that they're amongst the easiest things in the world to sell, right? And so not only does it provide you with a guaranteed return, but it also is very liquid, right? And there's a measure of safety in that. Finally, finance encourages specialization in trade, right? So finance actually is an important way in which businesses can break up into smaller activities. One of the things that we see in less developed countries that do not have developed financial systems is they tend to have these big conglomerates, often family-run businesses. These big conglomerates that do sell cars, mine coal, do fashion, have financial services arms, right, all over the place. And from an outsider, there's just this question of, why would a firm be doing so many things? But many firms have to rely on internal finance. They have to rely on finance from within the organization, right? And so one of the things that does is that encourages them to try to be the jack of all trades and try to use money from one business to fund money from another business. We don't see much of that in the U.S., or not as much of that, and in part because we have these incredibly complex systems and systems by which we can lend money to each other, right? So if I'm a firm and I need to buy some inputs from another firm, I have the ability to borrow 90 days, same as cash, right? Most firms take advantage of that in some way. We as consumers take advantage of that every time that we pay with a credit card, right? Every time you use a credit card, you're essentially getting 20, 23, well, it depends exactly when your credit card's due, but maybe on average 15 or 20 days of free finance in there. And that makes your life easier. And it encourages you to trade, and encourages you to specialize in smaller projects. And then finally, here, financial systems are also a way to monitor managers, right? How do I know that the people at Google are doing a good job? Well, financial markets actually give us an ability to measure how well they're doing by looking at a stock price, right? And where does that stock price come from? It comes from the fact that thousands and thousands of people are monitoring Google every day, looking at their performance, looking at their financial fundamentals, trying to evaluate how Google is doing. And that's so that stock price is really the collective opinion of thousands and thousands of informed people. It doesn't mean that it's right, but it means that it's probably the best information that's available out there. So you put all these things together, and the analogy that I often will use is that you have to think about finance and financial systems like a brain, the brain of an economy, right? And it's a brain because financial systems are really about getting resources to the parts of the economy that need them the most, right? Just like your brain is moving energy, blood, other vital resources to the places that you need it most. If you start to run, your brain says, get the blood flow to your legs, right? Financial systems do the same thing for the economy. And so when you don't have a developed financial system, it's really like having brain damage, right? You're going to have a very inefficient economy that's likely to grow not very fast. And so this is why when you look at the empirical evidence, and I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail, but as I have here in this quote, the causal link between finance and growth is one of the most striking macroeconomic relationships uncovered in the last decade, right? That there is an extremely strong relationship between having financial development and having economic development. And if you look here, see, if you can see this a little bit, let me expand this. This is just looking at the average amount of credit within an economy based on GDP. And one of the things you see here is countries at the left, which are low-income countries, only have financial systems that are about 11% of GDP, as compared to high-income countries where financial systems are upwards of, 140, 160% of GDP, right? And so it's just one piece of evidence that suggests that, yes, that countries that have higher, larger financial systems are richer, right? Okay. Sorry. Still trying to figure this out a little bit. Okay. Finally, in this last small part of our lecture, one of the things that I think maybe hopefully you've been convinced of here in my discussion is that the lack of finance is a key to understanding poverty, right? That one of the worst things about living on $1.25 a day, which is the World Bank definition of extreme poverty, is you don't actually get $1.25 every day, right? You some days get $5 and then other days you don't get anything, right? And so the lack of evenness in your income means that the poor really need finance, but of course it's the poor who often you usually don't have access to finance. If I can switch back here. I want to show you a handout. Actually, it's not popping up here, but if you look at figure 9.1 and these additional handouts, here we go. Do this a slow way. All right. Here's looking at access to formal loans and deposit accounts per 1,000 adults. And so one of the things you see here is the huge difference between the number of loan and deposit accounts in rich countries relative to poor countries, right? In sub-Saharan Africa, for every 1,000 adults, there's only 28 loan accounts and 163 deposit accounts, relative to developed countries where out of 1,000 adults, there's 700 loan accounts, right? And there's 2,000 deposit accounts, right? Same thing if you look at firms and their access to finance, right? Here you see in the Middle East, which is in Africa, which is the least financially developed part of the world, only about 25% of firms have access to finance. In the US, this is about 80%, right? So it just gives you some idea. So many firms don't have access to finance. Where do they get finance then? Well, usually it's informal finance. They borrow money from family or friends or from a loan shark. But of course, the problem with that is that can be risky, right? It's sometimes physically risky if you're borrowing from a loan shark, but it can also be very, very costly, right? Very costly. I always, whenever I think about this, I think about when I lived in Botswana, and at the local supermarket that I walked to every day, there was always a row of women who sold cell phone minutes, right? So most people in Botswana did not have cell phone plans, but they would just buy minutes to use on their phone. And women would sell these at kind of street side stands. And so I was talking to the women and kind of trying to figure out how they run their business. And one of the things I learned is that these women were basically able to borrow the money to buy the cell phone minutes. And to borrow the money, it cost them about 5% a day. Now, these women, in their opinion, that wasn't very much, right? To buy $20 of cell phone minutes, it cost me $21, right? So what's $1, right? But if you actually think about that, that is incredibly expensive. 5% a day, if you transfer that into an annual compounded interest rate, it meant that if you borrowed $1 today, you'd owe $20 million at the end of the year, right? That's a compounded interest rate, right? That's the effective interest rate that these women were paying. And so it just goes to show you how incredibly costly informal finance can be, right? It can be extremely costly. And it's one of the things that keep poor people poor, right? So these are the things that we take for granted in rich countries, right? In rich countries, we have credit cards, we have home loans, we have mortgages, we have insurance, we can get our checks cashed anywhere, we can make payments on Venmo, right? All of this stuff we take for granted, even though we shouldn't, because there's many Americans who don't have access to finance. About 20% of all American households are what economists call underbanked. And by underbanked mean that they don't have the full range of banking services in terms of loans, deposit accounts, checking cards, etc. About 25% of people making less than $30,000 a year are underbanked, right? So it's primarily the poor that is underbanked. And so how do these people get financial services? Well, many of them go to a payday lender, right? Which is essentially what these women on the street selling minutes in Botswana were relying upon as well. According to the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the typical payday loan is about $100 for 2 weeks. And the cost of that is about $15. So you pay about 15% to borrow money for 2 weeks. That is an annual compounded interest rate of about 400% a year, right? These are the things that keep poor people poor, right? And so these are the things that make finance so important, not just to individual welfare, but to our aggregate welfare in terms of economic growth. So that's kind of an introduction to why finance is important. We're going to take a break here, and in the next video, we're going to come up and talk about kind of an introduction to this class in terms of talking about bonds, stocks, financial intermediaries, and the Federal Reserve. Back in a moment.